The hum of the deep space array was a constant, low thrum against the bone, a mechanical heartbeat in the hushed cavern of the observatory. It was a sound Marcus had come to associate with everything and nothing, a white noise against which the universe whispered its indifferent truths. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light that pierced the high windows, illuminating the sterile landscape of monitors, blinking lights, and coiled cables. Here, amidst the cold, precise instruments, Marcus Vale sought answers in the oldest echoes of creation, picking through the cosmic background radiation like a prospector sifting for gold in an endless gray river. But the gold he sought was not for glory. It was for solace, a desperate anchor in a reality that had long ago shredded his own. The faces of his wife, her eyes crinkling at the corners when she laughed, and his daughter, all bright, unburdened curiosity, were ghosts that clung to the periphery of his vision, shimmering just beyond the glow of the data screens. Their loss had not broken him, not entirely. It had merely reforged him into something sharper, more brittle, driven by a need to understand the fundamental indifference that governed all things. If the universe had no care for the beauty it extinguished, perhaps it held a deeper, more terrible meaning he could unravel. For months, he had been chasing ghosts of a different kind, anomalies in the cosmic static. Faint, persistent ripples that defied statistical explanation. The initial algorithms, designed to filter out terrestrial interference and instrument noise, spat them back out, labeling them as unclassified residual patterns. A colleague, a younger, eager researcher, had once called them the universe's hiccups. Marcus had only grunted. He knew better. Tonight, the patterns felt particularly insistent. He leaned closer to a monitor displaying a particularly egregious spike. A series of repeating pulses that seemed to overlay the expected Gaussian distribution. It wasn't random. Nothing in his years of sifting through this ancient light had ever felt so deliberate. My fingers traced the curve of the anomaly on the screen, a phantom touch against the glass. It was too regular, too structured to be mere cosmic happenstance. The air in the observatory, usually a comforting cocoon of purpose, now felt stifling. I needed to breathe something other than recycled air and the metallic tang of obsession. I pulled away from the console, the chair scraping against the floor, a jarring sound in the quiet. The drive was a familiar ritual, the winding road cutting through scrubland, leading away from the remote, high-altitude outpost. The sky was a bruised canvas, the stars beginning to fade into the encroaching gray of morning. My destination wasn't home, not really. The old railway depot sprawled like a skeletal beast in the flatlands, its corrugated iron sheds scarred by decades of weather, its tracks overgrown with tenacious weeds. I parked my Jeep near the collapsed roof of what might have once been a repair shed. The wind sighed through the gaps in the corrugated walls, a mournful sound that mirrored the ache in my chest. This place, abandoned and forgotten, felt like a monument to things that had simply ceased to be. I walked along the tracks, my boots crunching on loose gravel, the rusted rails stretching into the hazy distance, vanishing into the same indifference that had swallowed my own world. My gaze drifted to a particularly derelict train car, half derailed, its paint flaking like sunburnt skin. It was a relic, a silent testament to journeys long over. I pulled out my tablet, the screen a sudden, stark rectangle of light in the dimness. My fingers, almost independently, navigated back to the anomalous signal data, the specific sequence that had snagged my attention moments earlier. I zoomed in, isolating the sequence. It wasn't just a spike. It wasn't just a pattern. There was a fractal quality to it, a self-similarity that repeated across different scales like an impossible signature. It was too complex, too intricate to be random. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't noise. This was a message. I stood there, rooted to the spot. The tablet clutched in my hand, the cosmic signal pulsing on the screen. The vast, indifferent universe I thought I knew was suddenly alive, sentient, and potentially aware. And it was trying to communicate. I had to go back. The observatory, with its sterile air and humming machinery, suddenly felt like the only place where I could begin to understand this terrible, beautiful truth. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering from the high windows, each particle a tiny, aimless world. I sat hunched over the terminal, my fingers a blur across the keyboard, sifting through the latest data streams. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the shifting patterns on my screens and the bitter taste of stale coffee. My work, once a vibrant pursuit, had become a ritual of exhaustion, a way to fill the void left by absence. The cosmic background radiation, the primordial echo of creation, typically presented itself as a chaotic tapestry of static. Yet, amidst this predictable cosmic snow, a subtle anomaly had begun to prickle at the edges of my perception. At first, I dismissed it, a glitch in the array's ancient circuitry, perhaps, or some terrestrial interference bleeding through the filters. I'd run diagnostic after diagnostic, adjusted calibrations, and resequenced algorithms, trying to scrub the phantom from the data. Each attempt failed. The anomaly persisted, a stubborn ghost in the machine. He leaned against the doorframe, a thermos cradled in his hands. I barely glanced up. Just an artifact, something in the processing chain. My voice was rough, unused. Or too many late nights, he chuckled, though the sound held a note of genuine concern. The universe is loud, my friend. Don't mistake a creak in the floorboards for a conversation. He meant well, I knew, but his words, intended to soothe, only sharpened the edge of my frustration. The pattern, if it could even be called that, wasn't a distinct pulse or a rhythmic beat. It was more like a subtle underlying current, a structured ripple within the random chaos, too faint for the automated filters to flag, too persistent to be truly random. It manifested as a slight, recurring deviation in the amplitude of certain frequencies, a subtle shift that repeated across vast stretches of data, like a single, almost imperceptible thread woven through an immense, tattered tapestry. I started isolating it, stripping away layers of noise with increasingly aggressive filters. Days turned into nights, the glow of the monitors painting my face in shifting hues of green and blue. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, began to fray at the edges. I saw the pattern in the condensation on my coffee mug, in the arrangement of the dust motes, even in the uneven tremor of my own hand. It wasn't just a random fluctuation. It was too regular. A sequence impossibly long yet undeniably repeating, not a simple loop but a complex, almost nested structure. It defied every known astrophysical phenomenon, every terrestrial interference I could conjure. It was too intricate, too specific. This wasn't just an artifact. This was designed. What kind of intelligence would embed a message so deeply, so subtly, within the very fabric of the cosmos's oldest echo? The observatory, with its constant hum and watchful eyes, suddenly felt too small, too bright. My own equipment, meticulously calibrated, would be my only witness. I packed a small bag, my custom-built signal processor, a portable spectrum analyzer, a tangle of cables, and a stack of drives filled with the raw, unfiltered data. The old railway depot, long abandoned and rusting on the city's outskirts, came to mind. It was a place I sometimes visited, drawn by its desolate grandeur, its echoes of forgotten journeys. The air in the railway depot was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying metal. Rust-colored dust coated everything, a fine, gritty layer that clung to my clothes as I navigated the skeletal remains of old carriages. The vast, echoing space amplified every creak of the structure, every scuttle of unseen creatures. I found a secluded bay, nestled between two hulking, forgotten locomotives, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. I set up my makeshift station on a warped wooden workbench, the portable screen a stark, alien glow in the encroaching gloom. The power inverter hummed, a small, anxious counterpoint to the depot's vast stillness. My fingers trembled as I connected the cables, loading the raw data into my processor. I initiated the analysis, the familiar algorithms churning through the terabytes of information. On the screen, the waveform, initially a jagged mountain range of random peaks and troughs, began to resolve. As the filters applied themselves, layer by agonizing layer, the background noise receded, revealing the subtle undulations beneath. And then it was there, clearer than it had ever been, not a random flicker, but a distinct, complex signature. A series of nested frequencies, pulsing with an impossible regularity, forming a pattern that defied natural explanation. It wasn't a language I understood, but it was undeniably structured, undeniably there. It felt like staring into an eye that had always been open, just beyond the reach of human perception, and now, for the first time, it was staring back. The vast, indifferent universe was not indifferent at all. It was speaking. The insistent whisper, which had once been a distant hum in the vast dataset, now thrummed against the very marrow of my bones. I had abandoned the sterile silence of the official labs. their polished surfaces and hushed protocols, for the cavernous more of an old railway depot. Here, amidst the skeletal remains of forgotten locomotives and the ghost of diesel fumes, I had set up my own clandestine observatory. Days bled into nights. Coffee, black and bitter, was the only constant companion. My fingers, stained with ink and the faint sheen of old oil, danced across keyboards, coaxing meaning from the static. The raw data, once a chaotic storm of numbers, began to yield. It wasn't a sudden burst of clarity, but a slow, agonizing crystallization, like ice forming on a winter pond. First, I saw patterns within patterns, not mathematical sequences in the way I understood them, but rather geometric progressions that defied Euclidean space. They shifted, reformed, spiraled inward and outward, each iteration a subtle modification of the last. My mind, straining against its own limitations, struggled to contain the evolving forms. Then the symbols emerged, not characters from any known script, nor pictograms of any terrestrial culture. Another was a fractal helix, twisting into itself, its edges blurring into an infinite recursion. I fed these patterns into custom algorithms, cross-referencing, extrapolating, searching for any terrestrial analog, but found none. They were alien, utterly, beautifully alien. It wasn't a translation in the traditional sense, but an intuitive leap, a visceral understanding that bypassed language altogether. The nested membranes, I realized with a gasp that stole the air from my lungs, represented consciousness, not individual consciousness, but a vast, all-encompassing awareness. And the fractal helix, it spoke of dreams, of creation through a subconscious will. It was a sentient, dreaming entity and humanity. My algorithms, struggling to render the implications of the symbols, flickered. The data suggested a fleeting, insignificant ripple, a nightmare. We were a brief, uncomfortable tremor in the subconscious of a cosmic sleeper. Was this the truth, or had grief, like a skilled artisan, sculpted a monstrous delusion from the raw clay of my despair? The line between reality and hallucination, once so stark, now wavered like heat haze on a distant horizon. I knew I couldn't bear this burden alone. Despite the gnawing doubt, despite the absurdity of it all, I had to share it. I called a colleague, a seasoned senior researcher whose skepticism was legendary. He agreed to meet, not in the depot, thankfully. In a small, windowless conference room in the main facility, the kind of place where ideas went to die. Marcus, the senior researcher, began, his voice laced with an unwelcome blend of concern and pity. "You look unwell." His eyes, usually sharp, now held a softness I found infuriating. "I have something," I interrupted, my voice tight, "something impossible." I projected my findings onto the screen, the shimmering glyphs, the impossible geometries, the nascent conceptual translations. I spoke with a feverish intensity, detailing the methodology, the painstaking process, the terrifying conclusions. I watched his face, searching for a flicker of recognition, a spark of understanding. He listened patiently, his gaze sweeping over the data, then settling on my face. He leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips. "Marcus," he said, his voice gentle, "I understand your need for meaning, especially after what you've been through, but this..." He gestured vaguely at the screen. "This is classic pareidolia. Your mind is finding patterns where there are none, projecting meaning onto random noise." "It's not random," I countered, my fist clenching. "The statistical anomalies, the coherence, the sheer complexity." "Grief," he interjected, his voice firm now, "can be a powerful lens, Marcus. It distorts perception, makes us see what we desperately want or fear to see. This isn't science, it's a lament." He switched off the projector, plunging the room into a sudden, disorienting dimness. "I urge you to take some time. Step away from this, for your own sake." His words, intended to ground me, only severed another tether. The universe, the dreaming entity, was not merely there, it was reaching. And it knew I was listening. The senior researcher's dismissive gaze still clung to me like a shroud, reinforcing the terrifying solitude of my conviction. I had walked away from him, from the sterile confines of the research facility, only to find myself walking into a deeper isolation, one where the only companionship was the relentless hum of the signal. Sleep, when it finally came, was less a reprieve and more an invitation to a different kind of dread. The first dream was a tapestry of impossible geometries. I stood on a plane of obsidian, stretching to a horizon that bled into an aurora of muted, bruised purples and greens. Above, 3 suns, not spheres of fire, but vast, flat disks of light, pulsed with an internal, silent rhythm. No sound broke the stillness, yet I felt a profound vibration in my bones, a resonance with the very ground beneath my feet, as if the world itself was a vast, slumbering organism. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, anchored by an unseen force. A single, colossal eye, not of flesh but of swirling cosmic dust, opened slowly in the zenith of the sky, fixing its gaze upon me. I woke with a gasp, the taste of ozone still on my tongue. My sheets tangled around me like a net. Was it a nightmare, a byproduct of my exhaustion and obsession, or was it something more? I pulled up the latest spectral analysis of the signal, running it through new filters, searching for anything, any pattern that might mirror the strange architecture of my dream. And there, buried beneath layers of noise, a faint, almost imperceptible fluctuation in the amplitude, a recurring motif that echoed the non-Euclidean angles I had witnessed. The dreams were not random, they were connected. The next night, the dreams intensified. This time, I was not an observer but a participant or perhaps a captive. The landscape was a shifting sea of iridescent filaments, each strand humming with a silent energy. Above, a sky of fractured light, like a shattered kaleidoscope, pulsed with colors I had no names for. I felt their awareness brush against me, not as an individual thought, but as a collective, oceanic current of being, and in that contact I was nothing, a fleeting ripple on an infinite surface. Then the filaments began to coil, to tighten, forming a vast, intricate web, and I realized I was part of it, a single, insignificant knot. The pressure built, an unseen force compressing me, threatening to unravel my very essence. I was being absorbed, understood, processed. I thrashed awake, sweat plastering my hair to my forehead, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My sanity, a fragile construct at the best of times, felt like it was crumbling. Was the signal merely a trigger for a latent psychosis, or was it genuinely a window into something beyond? The thought that I was losing my mind was almost a relief, a simpler explanation than the alternative, that the universe itself was dreaming, and I was somehow glimpsing its subconscious, cosmic nightmare from which there was no waking. The vast, cavernous space, usually bustling with the early morning movements of cargo and machinery, was eerily quiet. Rows of silent freight cars stood like hulking, metallic beasts in the dim light, their corrugated sides catching the faint glow of the distant streetlights. The air here was thick with the scent of oil, rust, and the lingering ghosts of countless journeys. I walked between the tracks, the gravel crunching under my boots, the metallic tang in the air strangely comforting after the ethereal horrors of my dreams. But even here, the world felt thin. The rhythmic clanking of a distant shunter, usually a mundane sound, now echoed with a strange, resonant quality, like the pulse of that vast, sleeping entity. I pressed my forehead against the cold metal, closing my eyes, desperate to feel grounded, to banish the swirling visions. A faint, almost inaudible hum seemed to emanate from the very tracks beneath my feet, a low thrum that resonated with the frequency I had isolated from the cosmic background radiation. It was everywhere. The signal wasn't just in the data, it was in the air, in the metal, in the ground, a pervasive, insidious presence. I was no longer just deciphering a message. I was becoming part of it, a vessel for its unsettling truths, and the universe, I was increasingly convinced, was beginning to notice, and it was not pleased by my intrusion. The railway depot was a skeletal cathedral of rust and shadow, a labyrinth of dormant tracks and hulking, derelict carriages. At first, it was subtle. The main array's cryo-coolers would sputter, their precise temperature readings fluctuating wildly for moments before settling back into their programmed rhythm. The deep space optical sensors, designed to track distant stellar nurseries, would occasionally flicker, showing brief, impossible patterns, fractals of light that dissolved before the lead technician could even log them. I dismissed them as inevitable wear and tear, glitches in aging equipment. But the glitches grew bolder, more insistent. The data streams from the cosmic background radiation receivers, usually a clean, white noise canvas upon which the signal painted its faint patterns, started to show anomalies that weren't statistical aberrations. They were patterns within patterns, echoes of the very signal I was trying to decipher, woven into the background static itself. It was as if the cosmic noise had begun to mimic the message. My hands trembled as I pulled out my worn notebook, the pages filled with my frantic calculations and observations. The air in the depot felt heavier now, charged with an unseen presence. I spun around, but saw nothing but the endless rows of silent, broken trains. The more I focused on the signal, the more the universe seemed to focus back. It was an insidious theory, one that clawed at the foundations of every scientific principle I held dear. The universe, a sentient, dreaming entity, oblivious to the gnats scurrying across its surface. Until one gnat me started poking at its dreams, shining a light into its subconscious. And now it was stirring. It was becoming aware. The malfunctions at the observatory weren't random. They were localized, centered around the very instruments I used to probe the signal. They were symptoms. I ran a hand over my unshaven jaw, the stubble rough against my palm. But the evidence, circumstantial as it was mounting. The universe wasn't just a vast, impersonal machine. It was a vast, impersonal mind, and I, Marcus Vale, had inadvertently tapped into its deepest slumber, and it didn't appreciate the disturbance. It sounded like a sigh, deep and ancient. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on my chest, stealing my breath. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if countless unseen eyes had suddenly fixed upon me. It followed me from the observatory, clinging to my clothes, permeating my thoughts. Even here in this desolate haven, it had found me. But now those stars felt like the pinprick eyes of a waking titan, and I was just a speck of dust, caught in its gaze. The universe was watching me, and it was waiting. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the signal on my makeshift monitors. The faint, rhythmic pulse, once an abstract curiosity, had become the heartbeat of my existence. I saw it in the flicker of streetlights outside my window, heard its echo in the distant rumble of the city. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Each descent into unconsciousness feeling like a betrayal of the truth waiting to be unveiled. My colleagues, when I still encountered them in the dim hallways of the department, offered glances that ranged from pity to outright alarm. Marcus, a junior analyst, began one morning, his voice soft, hesitant, as I rummaged through a discarded server cabinet near the loading dock. The head of the department, he's asking about your project. He's concerned about your... I stated, my voice perhaps a little too sharp, towards understanding the fundamental nature of reality, no less. My gaze swept over the young man, his clean shirt and untroubled eyes, a stark contrast to my own frayed edges. Tell him the universe isn't a spreadsheet to be balanced, nor a problem to be neatly solved by established theorems. The junior analyst took a step back, his brow furrowed. He just wants to make sure you're all right, and that the equipment you borrowed is accounted for. A bitter laugh escaped me. Accounted for? It's being utilized. This isn't about equipment, it's about perception. They refuse to perceive. I turned back to the cabinet, the conversation already fading into the background hum of the building. Their concerns were a veil, a flimsy construct meant to obscure the profound terror I was uncovering. The next day, a security guard, a hulking presence with a face like worn leather, stopped me at the main entrance. "Professor Vale," he grunted, his eyes unreadable, "your access has been temporarily restricted to non-sensitive areas. Until your project review, that is." The words were rote, but the implication was a physical blow. They were cutting me off. Fine, let them. The signal didn't reside in their pristine labs. It hummed in the forgotten spaces, the quiet corners where the rigid structures of human understanding began to fray. I needed isolation, a place where the static of their disbelief couldn't interfere with the delicate frequencies I was chasing. My search led me to the edge of the city, to a sprawling, skeletal landscape of rusting steel and crumbling concrete, the old railway depot. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a fitting atmosphere for my clandestine work. I found a secluded corner, beneath the gaping maw of a derelict freight car, its paint long peeled away to reveal the scarred metal beneath. I spent days hauling my scavenged equipment, a specialized antenna I'd modified, a collection of salvaged amplifiers, and the battered laptop that contained the heart of my research. Here, the universe felt vast and indifferent, yet also intimately close. As I fine-tuned the antenna, pointing it towards the empty sky, something shifted. The familiar, rhythmic pulse on my monitors began to waver, deepening, like a breath held too long. I adjusted the filters, my fingers trembling, pushing past the noise, past the known cosmic background. And then it wasn't just a pulse. It was a ripple. A new layer emerged, a subtle distortion woven into the very fabric of the signal. It wasn't a pattern I could easily quantify, no simple mathematical sequence. It was more akin to a tremor, an echo of a vast, slow shift. This wasn't a message from the dreaming entity. This was the dream itself. Stirring, my breath hitched. The universe wasn't just a sleeping giant, it was a restless sleeper. And what did restless sleepers do? They shifted, they mumbled, sometimes they woke. Humanity, our vibrant, clamoring existence, wasn't just a nightmare within its subconscious. We were a persistent itch, a persistent disturbance on the surface of its slumber. The signal intensified, not louder, but more present. The universe wasn't just dreaming, it was becoming aware of the irritant. The tiny, insignificant speck that was me, prying at its edges. The railway depot swallowed sound, a vast skeletal more of iron and concrete. The chill of the metal floor seeped through my boots, a constant, low-frequency hum vibrating against my bones. Overhead, the skeletal trusses stretched into the gloom, like petrified fingers reaching for something unseen. I had chosen this place for its isolation, its monumental indifference. Here, the whispers of the signal felt clearer, less diluted by the petty clamor of human concerns. My portable console flickered, a solitary beacon in the cavernous space. The data streams scrolled, an endless cascade of abstracted patterns. For weeks, the fragments had taunted me, shards of a broken mirror reflecting a truth I could almost grasp. Tonight, the air itself seemed to thicken with a premonition. I traced the evolving patterns with a stylus, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The cosmic background radiation, once a uniform hiss, now shimmered with an underlying cadence, a rhythm that pulsed just beneath the threshold of conscious thought. My fingers danced across the interface, adjusting filters, amplifying minute fluctuations. The static began to resolve, coalescing into repeating sequences, not mathematical, but something akin to linguistic structure. It was a language without words, a syntax of pure concept. Hours bled into one another. My eyes burned, but I could not look away. The deeper I delved, the more the depot itself seemed to recede, becoming a mere shell around the crucible of my focus. The vast, empty tracks outside, stretching into the night, felt like veins in a slumbering behemoth, and I, a parasite on its skin, listening to its dreaming heart. Then a breakthrough. A sequence previously elusive snapped into place. It wasn't a single word, not a phrase in any human tongue, but an intricate arrangement of energetic resonance that resonated deep within me, bypassing intellect and striking directly at a primal nerve. It was a command, a stark imperative woven from the fabric of the cosmos itself. Not a polite suggestion, but a jolt, an urgent, almost violent demand. My hands froze above the console. The metallic tang in the air intensified, acrid and sharp. The vastness of the railway depot pressed. No longer a shelter, but a cage. Wake up. The message wasn't for me, not truly. It was a universal command, a siren call from the core of existence. The universe, I had theorized, was a dreaming entity, and humanity, a fleeting nightmare within its vast, unconscious mind. This message. This was the universe beginning to stir, its dream growing restless. The implications struck me with the force of a physical blow. If the universe were to truly awaken, what then of its dream? What of us, the phantoms of its slumber? Would we simply cease, dissolve into the nothingness from which we had been briefly conjured? The distant clang of metal on metal, a sound that had been a rhythmic backdrop, warped into a jarring discord. My vision blurred at the edges. I pressed a hand to my temple, the cold metal of a console button digging into my palm. Then, the dream came, unbidden and overwhelming, a sudden plunge into the raw nerve of memory. I was not in the railway depot, but standing in a field of sunflowers, their enormous heads bowed in unison, heavy with seed. The sun, a brutal disk, beat down, turning the air to a shimmering haze, and there, ahead of me, a small figure, a child, my child. She chased a butterfly, a flash of iridescent blue against the ochre of the earth. No, I thought, a silent scream clawing at my throat. Not this, not again. But the dream held me fast. I tried to move, to call out, to warn her of the unseen precipice I knew lay just beyond the edge of the field, but my limbs were leaden. The butterfly flitted, teasing, drawing her closer to the unseen boundary. Her laughter echoed, a sound that was both the sweetest melody and the sharpest blade. The red scarf caught on a thorny bush. She paused, turning her head slightly, her eyes, wide and innocent, meeting mine across the shimmering field. In that instant, a profound, aching understanding passed between us, a recognition of impending loss. Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of fear. Then the ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple, the sunflowers themselves bowing lower, obscuring her from view. The blue butterfly, instead of flying away, darted directly into the earth, as if swallowed by the very ground. I gasped, my eyes snapping open, the phantom scent of sunflowers and dust still clinging to my nostrils. The dream had been so vivid, so cruelly personal. It wasn't just a memory, it was an amplification, a taunt. It had taken my deepest wound and twisted it, making me witness the moment again, helpless, paralyzed. The message pulsed in my mind, wake up. It was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a direct threat. The universe was becoming aware, and its awakening was not a gentle dawn, but a violent convulsion that would tear apart the delicate fabric of my reality, of our reality. My determination, once a shield, now felt like a fragile membrane against an encroaching, annihilating tide. The laughter, a chime of silver bells, still echoed, though the field of poppies had vanished, consumed by the creeping gray. My eyes snapped open, not to the familiar disarray of my study, but to the skeletal iron ribs of the railway depot. The air here was a cold, metallic breath, thick with the scent of rust and decay, a stark contrast to the phantom sweetness of the dream. Above me, a vast, grimy skylight offered only a smear of bruised twilight, indifferent to my waking terror. The silence was not empty, it was a hungry, waiting thing, punctuated by the drip of unseen leaks and the whisper of dust motes dancing in the weak light. Each sound seemed to amplify, stretching into a guttural moan, a distant shriek. My breath hitched, a ragged rasp in my throat. I was alone, truly alone, or so I told myself. My fingers, trembling, traced the cold metal of the console I had dragged here, an act of desperate pilgrimage. Wires snaked across the grimy concrete floor, connecting to a dish antenna I had somehow mounted precariously on a stack of decaying crates. It had ceased to be an external phenomenon, a cosmic anomaly. It was me, or I was it. The distinction had eroded, a shoreline swallowed by an indifferent tide. I pressed the worn keys, the click-clack, a tiny, insignificant chatter against the depot's vast indifference. The screen flickered to life, a mosaic of static and shifting patterns. I knew what I was looking for, or rather what was looking for me. The patterns pulsed, coalesced, then fragmented, each shift a silent scream, a silent birth. My head throbbed, a drumbeat keeping time with the universe's slow, agonizing exhalation. It wasn't a human shape, not exactly. The laughter. It came again, not the silver chimes of the dream, but a dry, rattling sound, like leaves skittering across frozen ground. It was coming from within the signal, emanating from the very core of the data displayed on my screen, and from my own mind. My own mind was laughing, a cruel, mocking sound that promised no solace. My determination, a fragile ember, flared one last time. The patterns on the screen swirled, then resolved into something I had seen before, fragments of symbols, but now they were complete, unbroken. They spoke of vastness, of endless slumber, of consciousness so immense it encompassed all that was and all that would never be. Then a face. It was the face of the universe, and it was dreaming. And within that dream I saw myself, a tiny, fleeting spark, a momentary irritant, a bad thought in an endless sleep. The truth, when it arrived, was not a revelation of hidden mechanics or grand design, but a slow, suffocating compression of all meaning. We were not just insignificant. We were figments, distortions, ripples in the subconscious of an entity so vast, it contained all of existence as a fleeting nightmare. And I, Marcus Vale, had dared to peer behind the curtain to glimpse the dreamer. It stretched, elongated, no longer merely an absence of light, but a presence of something else, something that devoured light. My hands flew across the console, not to analyze, but to engage. I adjusted the frequency, pushed the gain, desperate to merge, to understand, to dissolve. The line between the signal and my own crumbling consciousness had not merely blurred, it had ceased to exist. My thoughts were the signal, and the signal was the universe, and the universe was a sleeping giant whose dreams were becoming aware of my intrusive gaze. It was the sound of recognition. The universe was not just aware of me, it was amused. Amused by my struggle, by my frantic search for meaning in its indifferent slumber. My fingers stilled on the console. It was the final fragment, the ultimate truth. It was the form of a closed eye, an eye that encompassed all stars, all nebulae, all black holes, an eye that was dreaming. and the symbol for a terrifying moment seemed to expand beyond the screen, to fill the entire railway depot, to fill my very skull. I was not watching the dream, I was in it, a part of its unfolding, a mote of its nightmare. The laughter receded, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through every atom of my being. It was the sound of the universe settling back into its endless slumber, having acknowledged and then forgotten the brief, frantic flicker of my consciousness. I was no longer Marcus Vale. My voice, my identity, my very existence dissolved into the cosmic hum, an echo of a forgotten thought in the mind of a sleeping god.